Another way that the Federal Reserve can do monetary policy is by buying or selling government bonds. So a bond is how the federal government, or any government really, borrows money. And we're going to talk about these more in a little bit, so we'll get much more into detail about what bonds actually are. But what's important here is what bonds actually are not. Bonds are not cash. So if the Federal Reserve wants to get more money into the system, it can go out and buy bonds from banks that own them and exchange those bonds for cash. So, say a bank owns $1 million worth of bonds. It can't use those bonds to loan out to people. Those aren't cash money. But if the Federal Reserve decides that it wants to buy those bonds from that bank, then that bank suddenly has $1 million in cash that it can use to loan out to people. In fact, this policy has been in place in the United States for some time. During the recession that's been going on, or was going on for a long time in the United States, the Federal Reserve was buying billions of dollars worth of treasury bonds from commercial banks. In other words, it was taking those bonds off their books and giving them in exchange cash, with the idea that that cash would be released out into the system. So if the Federal Reserve wants to do expansionary policy, it buys up commercial bonds from banks, and that releases cash into the system. And if it wants to do contractionary policy, then it starts to sell off more of the bonds that it's holding. And therefore, it sucks up the cash from the system. So, expansionary policy done by the Federal Reserve is to buy bonds from commercial banks, and contractionary policy done by the Federal Reserve is to sell bonds to the commercial banks. So if it buys bonds, that releases money into the system. And if it sells bonds, you could think of those bonds as being like sponges that suck up all of that cash. If it sells bonds, it takes cash out of the system, and that is contractionary policy. And now, one last way that the Federal Reserve in the United States can do expansionary or contractionary policy is by either raising or lowering the interest rate that it gives commercial banks. So commercial banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve. And if the Federal Reserve wants to encourage those banks to borrow more money and therefore loan that money out to more people, all it has to do is lower the interest rate that it charges to banks. So here you can think of an interest rate as being the cost of borrowing money. So if I have a 1% interest rate and I want to borrow $100, that $100 costs me $101, right? So if that interest rate gets low enough, commercial banks will borrow as much money as they can because they assume that they can make more money off of that borrowed money. To them, it's like free money, essentially. So if the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates, banks borrow a lot of money from the Federal Reserve, and that puts more cash into the system. And if the Federal Reserve raises its interest rates, that discourages banks from borrowing money, which slows down the economy. So we said that buying and selling bonds is a way that Federal Reserves do expansionary and contractionary policy. And then just now we said the third way that they do expansionary or contractionary policy is either lowering the interest rate that they charge to banks, that would be expansionary policy, or raising the interest rate that they charge to banks, that is contractionary policy.